The train cut across the open Dakota plain, its whistle fading into the wind. Dust rose in pale sheets from the tracks, blurring the horizon where endless grass met a low gray sky. Clara pressed her gloved hands against her lap and steadied her breath. She had come a long way for this, answering an advertisement pinned to the notice board of a city hospital. Wanted, nurse willing to serve a mining camp in Dakota Territory. Room and board provided, strong constitution required. It had been written in a hurried hand, almost careless, yet it was the only door that had opened to her when every other had closed. The wheels shrieked, slowing, and the carriage jolted. Outside, a settlement appeared, rough and raw as if it had been hammered together overnight. A saloon leaned on its stilts. A row of cabins smoked thin lines into the air, and the ground looked trampled by boots, horses, and wagons. A group of men stood near the platform, their jackets dusty, their beards untrimmed. Their voices carried up before the train had fully stopped. Laughter, sharp and cutting, mixed with the clang of a hammer on iron. Clara stepped down, her skirt brushing against coal soot. She kept her back straight, though her stomach churned. One of the men spat near the rails and nudged his companion. "That's her? The mail-order nurse?" The word slid through the crowd like a sneer. A few chuckled. Another shook his head. "Won't last a week." She felt the heat in her face but said nothing, her grip firm on the small leather case she carried, bandages, herbs, scissors, and a bottle of carbolic acid she had guarded like treasure. A shadow blocked her path. He was taller than the others, shoulders set like stone. His beard was trimmed close, his hair dark, his eyes unreadable. The men hushed when he stepped forward. He didn't remove his hat. "Miss," he said flatly. No greeting, no welcome. His gaze traveled from her boots to her bonnet, as if measuring whether she belonged. "You're here for the miners?" She nodded. He gave a faint shake of his head, almost in disbelief. "Name's Elias Carter, foreman." His voice carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "Don't know what promises were made to you, but this camp doesn't have time for someone looking to play nurse." Her fingers tightened on the handle of her case. "I'm not here to play at anything, Mr. Carter. I'm here to work." He didn't respond, only studied her as if she were another problem added to his long list. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off the platform. The men followed, some still smirking. Clara stood for a breath, the wind lifting her skirt hem, and then stepped after him. The walk into camp was harsher than she had expected. The ground was rutted and wet from recent rain. Cabins stood at crooked angles, patched with tar paper. The sound of picks and shovels carried up from the shaft where the miners worked, each strike echoing like a heartbeat. The air smelled of smoke, iron, and sweat. Elias strode ahead without looking back, but Clara kept her pace steady. She would not stumble. She would not give them reason to doubt her before she had even begun. When they reached a cabin near the edge of camp, Elias stopped. This was the cook's before he left. "You can stay here." He pushed the door open. Inside, a cot leaned against the wall, rough blankets folded at the end. A stove squatted in the corner, rust marking its sides. It was sparse but dry. Clara set her case down gently, as if placing it in a sick room. She turned to thank him, but he was already gone, the door creaking in the wind. She sat on the cot and let her shoulders ease for the first time since the train. Alone, she could let the sting of their words touch her. Mail-order nurse. She pressed her palms together. She had not come for their approval. She had come because she had nothing left behind her, and because perhaps, just perhaps, her skill could carve a path forward. She straightened again, hearing voices rise outside. Her work would begin sooner than anyone expected. The first test came before nightfall. A boy of no more than 16 stumbled into the cabin door, his face pale, his sleeve soaked with blood. Clara rose at once, steadying him before he fell. "Sit down here," she told him, guiding him onto the cot. The wound was fresh, the gash along his forearm deep but not beyond saving. She unlatched her case, hands moving with trained certainty. Bandages unrolled, scissors snipped, carbolic acid burned in the air. The boy winced, teeth clenched. "Pick struck me," he muttered, trying not to sound afraid. His eyes darted toward the open door where miners lingered, curious. Clara worked quickly, stitching with steady fingers, speaking little. Words often frightened patients more than silence. When the bleeding slowed and the wound was bound neat and clean, she finally said, "You'll be sore, but you'll heal." She met his eyes. "Keep it dry." The boy blinked as if surprised by her calmness. Then with a short nod, he rose and left. Outside, the men who had gathered whispered. One spat again, but the mocking tone had softened into something more guarded. By dusk, Elias returned. His boots thudded against the cabin floor as he stepped in, his eyes flicking to the now empty cot. "He came here," he said, as if he had already heard. Clara lifted her chin. "Yes, he's patched up. He'll live." Elias crossed his arms. His expression did not change, yet there was a pause, a moment of stillness as if he weighed her worth in silence. Finally, he gave a short nod. "We'll see how long you last." Then he turned and left again, the door swinging closed behind him. That night, Clara did not sleep easily. The wind rattled the shutters, and the camp seemed alive with strange sounds. Boots dragging, voices raised. A cough carried through the night air. She lay on the cot, staring at the rough beams overhead. She had faced worse in city hospitals, but never so far from help. Never where her own survival depended as much on strength as on skill. Still, her heart did not falter. The boy's stitched arm was proof she could belong here. The next days blurred into a rhythm of hard work. Miners came with cuts, burns, and swollen joints. Clara boiled water until steam filled the cabin, washed wounds, wrapped bandages, and mixed poultices. She earned little thanks but fewer jeers. Men who had laughed now watched with a careful respect. She did not complain, not even when her hands cracked from lye soap or when the stove smoked and stung her eyes. She moved with purpose, quiet and steady, like someone who had already decided not to break. Elias remained distant. He spoke little when he crossed her path, his face carved from the same stone as the hills around them. Yet she noticed things. How he carried a ledger under his arm, pages thick with numbers. How his gaze lingered on the ridge where a small cross stood, half hidden by grass. Once, when a miner grew too loud in his mocking, Elias silenced him with a look alone. Clara said nothing, but she saw. Late one evening, as she carried a bucket of water from the pump, she paused. Across the camp, Elias stood with a lantern, checking the shaft where the men would descend come morning. The light caught his face, weary yet watchful. For a moment he seemed less like the foreman who dismissed her and more like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. Then he turned, the lantern swinging, and walked into the dark. Clara exhaled, lifting the bucket again. The work was only beginning. Trust would take longer, but she was still here, and that mattered. Morning came cold, the sky streaked with pale gold. Clara rose early, wrapping her shawl tight as she lit the stove. The smell of ash filled the cabin, but soon it softened under the warmth of boiling water. She set bread to toast and ladled porridge into bowls. Her own stomach growled. But she thought of the miners, men who labored from dawn until dusk, living mostly on beans and dried meat. Food was as much a medicine as bandages. She carried the pot to the mess hall, where benches creaked under the weight of tired bodies. At first no one moved. Then one of the younger men sniffed and muttered, "Smells better than what we had last week." Laughter followed, but this time it was not sharp. It was lighter, almost grateful. Clara set the pot down, serving spoon in hand, and said nothing. She let the food speak for itself. Men reached out, filling bowls, and soon the hall filled with the scrape of spoons. Elias appeared at the doorway, his hat low, his gaze scanning the room. He saw her but did not speak. Instead, he took a bowl and sat at the far end, listening as the men muttered quieter than usual. For once there was no jeer, no mockery. Clara ate last, a small portion, her hands folded afterward. She caught Elias watching her, but when their eyes met, he looked away. The days lengthened into weeks. With every wound she mended and every meal she prepared, Clara wove herself into the fabric of camp life. Men who had doubted her began to leave small signs of respect. A nod here, a muttered thanks there. One even set a sprig of wild rose by her cabin door, awkward but sincere. She held it for a moment, remembering the garden she had left behind in the city, and then placed it in a tin cup by her cot. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the plains. The wind howled, bending the cabin's rattling windows loose in their frames. Rain slashed sideways, soaking the earth to mud. Clara moved quickly, covering the stove and tying down the shutters. When a shout rose from the shaft, she ran with the others. Elias was there already, barking orders above the storm. 2 men had slipped on the ladder, crashing against the timbers. Clara did not hesitate. She knelt in the mud, her skirt heavy with rain, and pressed her hands to a miner's bloodied head. "Hold him steady," she shouted. Another miner obeyed, pressing the man's shoulders. Clara wrapped the wound with her scarf, the fabric soaking scarlet in moments. She looked up through the storm to Elias, who crouched beside her. His hand steadied the injured man's leg, his jaw clenched. For the first time they worked side by side, his strength holding what her skill could bind. When at last the man was carried to shelter, Clara stood trembling, soaked through. Elias looked at her, rain streaking down his face, and gave a single nod. It was not praise, not gratitude, but something firmer. Recognition. Trust. Then he turned, leading the men back into the storm. That night, as thunder faded and the camp lay dark, Clara sat by the stove, her scarf rinsed and drying. Her body ached, but her spirit glowed faintly. She had proved herself, not in words, but in work. And though Elias Carter had said little, his nod had been enough. The storm passed, but the camp did not grow quiet. Whispers stirred like restless wind, circling from cabin to cabin. Clara noticed it first in the mess hall. The way 2 men leaned close, their words cut short when she entered. Later she caught a glance, sharp and narrow, from one of the older leaders in camp, a man named Harlan Pike. His face was thin, his eyes dark with suspicion. He spoke often to the men, his voice carrying louder than most. "She's here for more than nursing," he muttered one evening, where the men gathered, his back against a post. Clara passed nearby, catching fragments of his tone. "Mail order nurse? What's that mean? Who sent for her? It doesn't look like any of us did." The men chuckled uneasily. Someone muttered, "Elias didn't." That brought sharper laughter. "Then what's she after? Camp's gold, or his name?" Clara kept walking, her chin lifted, though her heart beat faster. She had known gossip in hospitals before, whispers about women who worked among men, but here the words carried a heavier weight. This was a place where trust meant survival, and suspicion could cut deeper than a knife. That night Elias knocked once on her door. She opened it, the lamp behind her casting light over his stern face. He didn't step inside. "You'll hear talk," he said flatly. "Don't answer it. Don't feed it." His eyes held hers, steady as stone. She swallowed. "Do you believe it?" His silence stretched, the wind moving between them. At last he said, "What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is the work." Then he turned and left, boots fading in the dirt. His words should have steadied her, but instead they left a hollow ache. If even Elias kept his distance, how would she stand against the rest? The next days grew colder, not just in weather, but in glances. A man refused her porridge, muttering he didn't eat food from strangers. Another came to her cabin with a burn but pulled back when she reached for his hand, grumbling, "I'll mend it myself." Yet, when the boy she had stitched weeks before defended her, voices rose against him too. The divide was clear. Some trusted her, some doubted, and many waited to see who would prevail. Clara carried on, silent, but steady. She boiled herbs, stitched wounds, baked bread, and washed bandages until her fingers were raw. She spoke little, but her hands spoke for her. Still, the unease grew, like a shadow stretching longer each evening. One night she walked to fetch water and saw Harlan Pike standing by the ridge where the graves lay. He tipped his hat slowly, a smile too sharp for kindness. "Strange thing," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "How quickly you found your place here. Quicker than most. Makes a man wonder what you came for." Clara held her bucket tight, the cold biting her palms. She said nothing, only turned and walked away. His laughter followed her down the path, thin and bitter. Inside her cabin, she set the bucket down and sank onto the cot. She pressed her face into her hands. For a moment the doubt stung sharp as the whispers. "Do I belong here? Or are they right?" But when she lifted her head, her eyes fell on the wild rose, still standing in its tin cup though its petals had faded. She touched it lightly. Faded or not, it was proof that not everyone doubted. Proof that trust could grow even in hard ground. The first fever came like a spark. A miner collapsed at the shaft, shaking with chills though the sun burned hot. Clara was called at once. She laid him on her cot, pressing a hand to his forehead already burning. His breath rattled, his skin damp with sweat. "It's fever," she whispered, more to herself than to the men who stood uneasily at the door. By nightfall, 3 more had fallen sick. By dawn the count doubled. The camp, once filled with clanging tools and gruff laughter, turned silent but for coughing. Clara's cabin overflowed, so she moved cots into the mess hall, spreading blankets on benches, laying wet cloths on browse. The smell of sickness grew heavy, sour, and sharp. She boiled water until her arms ached, mixed willow bark for pain, and bathed men in cold cloths to keep the heat from climbing higher. The whispers that had once mocked her fell away. No one laughed now. No one questioned her place. They only watched her work, faces pale with fear. Every hour she bent over another body, her own strength draining. Still she did not stop. She whispered small prayers under her breath, not polished words but steady ones. Let this one breathe easier. Let the fever break. Days blurred. Night bled into morning without rest. Clara moved from cot to cot, her skirts damp with sweat, her hands cracked from washing. She learned to measure time by coughs, by the clink of spoons against bowls, by the low moans that rose and fell like waves. Each man she saved gave her hope. Each man she lost pressed on her chest like a stone. Then Elias fell. It was evening when he staggered into the hall, his strong frame shaking, his eyes glazed. Clara caught him before he dropped to the floor. "No," she whispered, her heart pounding. She guided him onto a cot, the lantern light flickering over his face. His skin burned hotter than the rest, his breath short. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt fear break through her calm. Elias tried to push her hands away. "Not me," he muttered, his voice rough, almost broken. "See to the others." But she pressed him down firmly. "You are one of them. You will not be left." He closed his eyes, turning his face aside, as if her words wounded him more deeply than the fever. That night, Clara sat by his cot, dipping cloths into cold water and laying them across his brow. She spoke little, only moved in quiet rhythm. Ring, press, change, repeat. Yet inside her thoughts swirled. He had been the one to doubt her most, to hold her at arm's length. Now his life lay in her hands, fragile as any other. She would not let him slip away. Around them, the hall echoed with coughs and groans. The air was heavy with fever, the lanterns burning low. Clara's body ached. Her eyes stung with weariness, but she did not leave his side. She watched every breath, every tremor, listening for change. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the walls. Inside, the fever deepened, and with it the weight of all she had yet to endure. The fever did not break. It spread faster than Clara's hands could keep up. Cots filled the mess hall, men coughing until their bodies shook. Buckets of water ran low. Bandages dwindled to scraps of torn shirts. Her herbs were gone, boiled down to bitter tea so thin it hardly mattered. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for Elias's forehead. His skin burned like fire, his lips cracked, his breath shallow. She tried to cool him with cloths, but the water was warm before she could wring it out. Her body sagged with exhaustion. She had not slept in 2 days, maybe more. The lines between waking and dreaming blurred. She whispered to herself as she worked. One breath at a time, one man at a time, but her strength faltered. When another miner begged for more tea, she had nothing to give. Her hands curled into fists. For the first time since stepping from the train, she felt the bitter edge of despair. Elias stirred. His eyes flickered open, glazed with fever. He caught her wrist, his grip weak but desperate. "Go," he rasped. "Leave me. Don't waste what little you have." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You're not to speak like that." "I won't abandon you." But he turned his face away, muttering broken words. "I lost her once. Don't let me lose you too." His voice cracked, half delirious, half true. Clara froze, her breath caught. She understood now. His grief was not only for the sick men or the camp, but for the wife he had buried on that ridge above. The vow that bound him was not made of stone, but of pain too deep to mend. His words cut her, but not with anger. They were pierced with sorrow. She pressed the cloth against his brow, whispering, "I am not her, but I will not leave." He did not answer. His eyes closed again, his chest rising in shallow rhythm. Clara bent over him, her body shaking. She wanted to believe her hands could save him, but doubt clawed at her. Supplies gone, strength drained. What if he slipped away like the others she could not hold? She pressed her palms together, silent, as if the act alone could lift the weight pressing her chest. Outside, the camp grew restless. Men argued in low tones, fear twisting their voices. Some whispered about leaving, scattering before the sickness took them all. Clara heard fragments. "She can't stop it. Too many sick. Maybe it's cursed." The words reached her ears, sharp as knives. She shut the door against them, leaning back until her shoulders touched the wood. Alone, she wept quietly, tears sliding down her face. But when she returned to Elias's side, the tears dried. She touched his hand, rough and calloused even in weakness. His pulse beat faintly beneath her fingers. She bent closer. "You are not alone," she whispered. "Not while I can still stand." Her voice wavered, but her resolve hardened. If her body failed, she would crawl. If her hands broke, she would use her breath. She had nothing left to give but herself, and she would give that without fear. The lantern sputtered low, shadows creeping across the walls. The fever raged, the camp trembled, and Clara, tired, nearly broken, clung to the only vow she had left. She would not let go. The night stretched on without mercy. Clara worked until her arms ached and her back throbbed. Each cough in the hall rang sharp in her ears. Each groan pressed her lower into weariness. But when she looked at Elias, his body burning, his breath shallow, something in her would not yield. She scoured the camp for anything left. In the corner of the cookhouse, she found a jar of dried willow bark, forgotten behind a stack of pans. She brewed it bitter and strong, straining it into a cup. At the pump, she drew water so cold it bit her skin, hauling bucket after bucket until her shoulders screamed. She soaked cloths and laid them across hot foreheads, refusing to let fever win without a fight. When the men saw her labor, some stirred from their fear. The boy she had stitched weeks ago helped fetch wood for the stove. Another carried water for her when her hands shook too much to grip the bucket. Slowly, the camp moved as one, quiet, stumbling, but following her lead. The whispers of doubt fell silent. What remained was need and her will to meet it. Elias tossed in fever dreams, his voice low and broken. He muttered names she did not know, pleaded with shadows she could not see. Once he tried to push her away again, his arm weak but trembling with old fear. She caught his hand in both of hers and held it firm. "You're here," she said softly, close to his ear. "You're not lost. Not this time." Through the long hours, she barely left his side. She fed him drops of tea when he could swallow, bathed his face with cool water, whispered steady words when his breath hitched. Her body begged for rest, her eyes burned, yet she stayed awake by sheer will. The fever reached its height near dawn. His chest heaved, his skin blazing, his body trembling under her hands. She pressed the last cold cloth to his brow, praying with every breath, "Stay with me. Please stay." Around her the hall was hushed, every man watching. The air was thick, waiting. Then, slowly, his breathing eased. The heat faded beneath her palm. The tremors stilled. Clara leaned closer, hardly daring to trust what she felt. But when she touched his cheek, it was cooler. His lips parted in a deeper, steadier breath. The fever was breaking. A sound rose in the hall, soft at first, then louder. Relief. Men exhaled, some crossing themselves, others bowing their heads. Clara closed her eyes, tears running down her cheeks, and let out a breath she had held for days. Elias was alive. He would live. She slumped against the cot, her strength gone at last. But her heart lifted, not only because she had saved him, but because the camp itself had been pulled back from despair. They had rallied, not because of doubt or fear, but because she had stood when all else faltered. When Elias's eyes fluttered open, weak but clear, they found hers. He did not speak. He only looked at her with a depth that needed no words. For the first time, the wall of grief between them cracked. She pressed his hand lightly, and he did not pull away. Outside, the sun rose, gold spilling across the plains. Inside the hall, the worst had passed. Life, fragile but real, remained. The sun climbed higher, but Clara barely noticed. Her body gave way at last. She had fought for too long without rest. When she tried to stand, her knees buckled. She sank into the chair beside Elias's cot, her head falling forward onto her arms. At last, sleep claimed her like a tide pulling her under. Hours later, she woke to the sound of footsteps. Men were stirring, voices lighter than before. The fever had begun to ease across the camp. Not every man survived, but most did. Clara rose slowly, her body heavy, her mind fogged. She moved from cot to cot, checking wounds, changing cloths, whispering steady words. Yet her hands shook and every step dragged like lead. When she returned to Elias, she found him awake. His eyes were clear now, though his face was pale. He watched her in silence as she worked, her hands fumbling with the cloth. At last he spoke, his voice weak but sharp. "You'll kill yourself." Clara paused, meeting his gaze. "I'll do what I must." "You've done enough," he said, trying to push himself up. She stopped him with a hand against his chest. "Lie still." But Elias shook his head, his eyes fierce, though his body trembled. "I can't watch it happen again. I buried one woman because she gave too much of herself. I won't bury another." His words cut through the quiet like an axe. Clara froze, her breath caught. So that was the truth. His vow, his distance, all the stone he carried in his face, it was grief, still raw, still bleeding. He had loved once, and loss had carved him hollow. Clara sat slowly, her hands folding in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing. Then softly she spoke. "I am not her. I can't be her. But I came here to heal not only for them," she gestured toward the men, "but for myself too." Her voice trembled, but held firm. "If I stop now, what was the point of coming?" Elias turned his face away, jaw tight. He did not answer. She could see the war in him, the fear of loss, the pull of duty, the ache of memory. He clenched his fists, the tendons sharp against his skin, as if holding himself back from something too dangerous to admit. Clara leaned closer, her voice steady. "You think love is a grave. But love is the reason these men lived through this fever. It's why I stayed when I had nothing left. It doesn't bury us, Elias, it keeps us breathing." Her words lingered in the stillness. Elias closed his eyes, his breath rough, but he did not push her away this time. He let her hand rest lightly on his silence no longer cold, but cracked with something breaking free. That night, Clara collapsed into her cot, her body trembling with exhaustion. Yet her heart carried a strange calm. She had spoken the truth aloud, though she did not know if he would let it in. Outside, the camp lay quiet, the fever loosening its grip. The worst had passed. But for her and Elias, the hardest choice still waited, whether to cling to grief or to step into something new. The days that followed were a slow climb from shadow into light. The fever loosened its hold. One man after another waking stronger, eating again, coughing less. The mess hall, once heavy with sickness, filled with the faint sounds of spoons and quiet talk. Life returned, though fragile as a candle flame. But Elias lingered between weakness and strength. Though the fever had broken, his body struggled to rise. Clara stayed close, bringing broth, lifting his shoulders when he coughed, steadying him when he tried to stand. She hid her fear behind calm words, though each time his chest rattled, her heart pressed hard against her ribs. One night, as the camp slept, he began to choke with a harsh cough. Clara sat up at once, rushing to his side. His face had gone pale, his breath shallow. Panic clawed at her, but she forced her hand steady. She fetched water, helped him drink, pressed his back until the fit eased. Still his body sagged, weak as a child's. "Don't stay," he whispered hoarsely, his eyes half closed. "If I go, you'll lose yourself too." Clara gripped his hand hard. "I will not lose myself by saving you. Don't ask me to walk away." His gaze flickered, tears burning though he tried to hide them. "I swore I'd never love again. I swore it, standing at her grave. Because love takes everything." His voice broke. "I can't give you that pain." Clara leaned close, her voice trembling but firm. "And what of this? Watching you fight, refusing to let me near. Does that not hurt more? You think you're saving me by holding back. But Elias, love is not the grave. Love is the reason I came here. The reason I stayed was when others fled. If I walk away from you now, that would be the true loss." Her words shook in the silence. Elias turned his face, and for the first time since she had met him, the stone of his grief cracked fully. His tears slipped into the pillow, his hand clutching hers with a weak but certain grip. He did not speak, but his silence no longer held her away. It drew her near. Through the long hours, Clara kept him breathing, spoon by spoon, cloth by cloth. When dawn came, pale and gold, he was still alive, his breath deeper, steadier. The men who entered saw him sitting upright, Clara beside him, their hands entwined. Murmurs spread quickly, but not with doubt. With relief. With respect. Harlan Pike, who had once sneered, stood at the doorway and removed his hat. "You saved him," he said quietly, the words rough in his throat. "You saved all of us." The others nodded, silent, their faces softer now. The gossip that once shadowed her was gone. In its place was something stronger. Gratitude, trust, and a bond forged in suffering. Elias's eyes found hers again, clearer now. No fever to cloud them. "You wouldn't let me go," he whispered. She touched his hand, weary but certain. "No, and I never will." The hall filled with morning light. Around them the camp breathed again. And between them something unspoken but unbreakable finally took root. The fever season ended slowly, like winter giving way to spring. One by one the men returned to the shaft, their strength creeping back with each passing day. The clang of picks echoed again, steady and familiar. Smoke rose from chimneys, bread baked in the ovens, and voices, once hushed with fear, grew lighter. Clara kept to her work, though the hall no longer overflowed. She stitched the last wounds, tended coughs that lingered, and sent men back to their cabins with smiles instead of tears. They called her nurse now with respect, no sneer in the word. Some brought her small gifts, dried apples, a polished stone, a carved spoon. Each token carried more weight than gold, proof that she belonged. Elias walked again, slowly at first, leaning on a staff carved by one of the miners. His strength returned in steps, but his eyes had changed more than his body. The wall of grief that once stood in them was gentler now, cracked open by all that had passed. When he looked at Clara, his gaze no longer turned away. One evening he found her at the ridge where the graves lay. She had carried a sprig of wild rose blooming faint pink, and set it at the foot of a cross. The wind moved softly through the grass. Elias stood beside her, silent for a time. "She was my wife," he said at last, his voice low. "I thought burying her meant burying my heart. Thought it safer to live hollow than to risk losing again." His eyes traced the horizon where the sky blazed gold. "But you showed me it isn't safer. It's just empty. Clara's hand brushed against his, light as a breath. "We carry loss," she whispered. "But we don't have to live in it." He turned to her, his jaw trembling, though he held himself steady. Then slowly he took her hand. Not in haste, not in desperation, but in quiet choice. She let her fingers curl into his, and for the first time since she stepped from the train, she felt truly at home. The camp thrived in the weeks that followed. Men worked with steadier hearts, bound not only by gold but by the memory of what they had endured together. Clara's cabin was filled with herbs she planted near the door, green shoots promising healing yet to come. The tin cup still held the faded rose, now joined by fresher blooms, reminders that life could renew itself even in hard soil. On a quiet evening, as the sun sank over the plains, Clara and Elias sat on the cabin steps watching the light fade. He did not speak often, but when he did, his words carried weight. "I never thought I'd have a partner again," he said softly. "But I see now you're not here to take what was hers. You're here to walk beside me." Clara leaned against him, her heart steady. "Not to replace, to begin." He nodded, his arm settling around her shoulders. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of trust, of healing, of a love not rushed but earned. The camp carried on, strong and alive. And on the far edge of the Dakota plains, a nurse and a foreman, two souls once bound by grief and doubt, found not just survival, but a home built on quiet vows spoken without need of words. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video so more listeners can find it. Subscribe for more frontier romances told in this same heartfelt way, and share it with someone who loves slow burn love stories. Thank you for listening.